Howdy, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Spring has sprung. It was a nice day today. Then it got cloudy. Hope you all got the last assignment. Write about one of the three foreign films, Persona, 400 Blows, Seventh Samurai. Write a paper about one of those. It's your choice. Watch the movie. They're all free on Canopy, so you should be able to have no problem seeing them. They won't cost you anything. Do a great job. Do an awesome job and go deep on the analysis. No reviews. Analyze what makes them tick. And don't compare them to current cinema. And please, if you have the little textbook writing about films, use it. It's there to help you. What else? I'm having trouble getting into Canvas. I don't know if you guys are too. I'm trying to get into it for 2 hours. It's not letting me. So I'm going to post this on YouTube, and I'll hopefully post it on Canvas later on today. We're into the 1960s now. Things are about ready to change in a big, big way. Next week, you guys are going to watch a documentary, and that's what your quiz is going to be based on. You can watch the documentary now. It's called Easy Rider Raging Bulls. It's free on YouTube. Watch it. Take notes. See what you think about it. It's all about what I'm going to talk about today and on Monday, because it's a big change that's coming to Hollywood. And what is propelling the change, what is fueling the change? Youth. Hollywood has sort of lost the direction, as I've been indicating in the last couple of lectures. And they're kind of clueless what to do. It's the old guard, the old generation, guys who are successful in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And since television, they've kind of lost their direction. And so their idea was to keep doing big budget entertainment spectacles, but people are staying home in droves. The older adults are staying home to watch TV, and the younger adults don't see anything that they're interested in. This say people under 25. And so they're resorting to foreign films that they could see at local universities. In certain cities, these films didn't play everywhere. Believe me, they didn't play in most towns in America, but they're university level cities. And so they're watching Fellini and Bergman and Antonioni and Jean-Luc Godard, and they're saying, why isn't American films making this? We're relating to these films. The way they look, the way they sound, the way the camera moves, the new style of storytelling was really exciting. And things started popping in the pop world. There's a shift in the music industry is happening, and it's driven by one band, the Beatles. They played on Ed Sullivan in 1964, and nothing has been the same since. Then Hard Day's Night came out, the movie. It's a brilliant mockumentary on the rise of the Beatles, and it's fun, and it's a lot, and kids flock to it in this country. They flock to it all over the world. Finally, they're saying something that they're excited about. And made by Richard Lester, who was actually spent his whole career. He's American, but he spent all his career mostly in London, and he almost single-handedly started the trend to film musicians in such a way to make it look like their lives are totally exciting, and every MTV video ever made in the 80s has Hard Day's Night to thank. And so does the Monkees, the TV series, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, believe it or not. And so there were some producers, some smart ones in this country who are saying, well, there's a whole market out there that isn't being tapped into, and that's the youth market. And what do they like? Well, they like rock and roll, they like sex, they like drugs, and this new music is driving it. And so this gentleman by the name of Roger Corman, who is still alive, by the way, he's in his early 90s, so just be thankful that he's still around. He's still got lots of ideas. Always a great interview. He got a partnership up with some people, and he started making movies simply for that market, the youth market. He didn't try to make boring adult, big budgeted entertainment movies that were playing at the local theater. His strategy was to make movies for the drive-in market. Now, who here has been into seeing a movie at a drive-in, where you drive your car up, watch it on the big screen? You could be in your car in your jammies and your Coke or your junk food they brought from home, or your booze or whatever you're doing in the car. During the 60s, a lot of people were having naughty sexual things happening in their cars at the drive-in. At one time, there's over 5,000 drive-in movie theaters in America. That's a lot, folks. And so Corman thought that maybe he can make movies just for that market, which was a smart concept. And what do kids like to see? Well, they like to see horror films. Yes, they do. And so he made a series of films based on Edgar Allan Poe's stories, and they were really popular. He got old school actors from the 30s and 40s, like Lon Chaney, who played the Wolfman in the 30s, and Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein in the 30s, and Bela Lugosi, who played Dracula in the 30s, and he got them to star. Now, they're old men now, folks. They're in their 60s, and they need the work. He got them to star in these movies, and then he'd put in young actors like Jack Nicholson. That's how he got his start. Like Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, Bruce Dern. These actors are going to start becoming the actors that are going to dominate the movies of the 60s and 70s. That's just now starting. And he started with Roger Corman on these low-budget horror films. He can make a movie in 6 days for $100,000. Nobody hardly gets paid. Everybody gets very little, but they financial reward, but they get experience. The cameramen, the cinematographers, the directors are chomping at the bit to get experience. This is long before we could all film a movie on our iPhones. You needed to have experience how to film a movie using film, actual movie cameras. And it was the average person, those don't come around. And especially 35 millimeter, you can't afford it. They're $100,000 then. And so how do you get to make a movie? Well, you work on these low budget movies and you learn. They were a great tool for the new directors that are coming up. Guys like Francis Coppola, Terrence Malick, Martin Scorsese. They're all learning on these low budget Roger Corman films. Then Corman decides to make biker films. It was a big deal. And it looked like they were outlaws, which appeals to the young kids. They all had long hair and tattoos, and the women all had, how should I say this? They all were dressing in leather pants, and they looked pretty sexy and hot on the back of their old kid at the drive-ins. And they starred Jack Nicholson and Peter Fonda and Bruce Dern and Harry Dean Stanton, Nancy Sinatra of all things. If you know who that is, Frank Sinatra's daughter, starred in The Wild Angels with Peter Fonda. And all of a sudden, these movies were made for very little money, $200,000 or $300,000 maybe, and they made $2 or $3 million. And in those days, that's a huge profit. The people got experience to be behind the camera and in front of the camera, and Roger Corman got wealthy off those movies by producing these out and putting them out in the world into the drive-in movie theaters. And you couldn't wait to see the next one. They usually have a pop rock and roll soundtrack. Kids related to these movies. They saw the freedom that these bikers had. That's not what they turned into. It was just a bunch of meth dealers who, most of them ended up in prison, and a lot of murdered people. Hell's Angels was not a healthy group to be involved in. Y'all should read a book by Hunter Thompson called The Hell's Angels. It's a nightmare, folks. He rode with them for about 3 years as he wrote that book before he was known as the gonzo journalist. Maybe you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, who wrote Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Where am I? The youth market. Old people, meaning people over 35, aren't interested in this. They think it's degrading. They think it's awful. Also, what's happening is the rating system, the old censorship that started in the 30s, we talked about, the Hayes Commission, is starting to lose its grip. And a new thing is starting to take over. And instead of having censorship, it's called a rating system. And they came up with the ratings. In the old days, it was G for general, M for mature, R for 16, unless you're accompanied by an adult, and X. Nobody under 16, no matter if you're accompanied by an adult or not. And the X, don't get it confused with porn. That's triple X. That's a different deal. This was X. And it's usually intense material. It could be violence. It could be sex, but not graphic sex like pornography. Adult themes. One of the great movies that came out at that time was called Midnight Cowboy, rated X, folks, with starring Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, and directed by the great John Schlesinger, one of the best movies ever made. Radical movie about a guy who goes to, he's from Texas. He considers himself somewhat of a stud, and he goes to New York to become a male prostitute. But not for men, folks, for women. He thinks wealthy women are going to pay to have sex with him. He finds out pretty quick that New York is a vicious animal, and he's going to have sex with all sorts of people if he thinks he's going to make it. Anyway, great soundtrack by Harry Nilsson, and legendary film. We'll talk about that later, in detail later. But then a series of films started happening. Film that came out in 1966 called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by Mike Nichols started to show old movie stars who were in it, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, in a new light. Filmed in glorious black and white by the great Haskell Wexler, cinematographer, who's wonderful at handheld use too. In this new way, they filmed the great Edward Albee play, one of the greatest American plays ever written, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Had been a successful Broadway production. Now it's a film, and kids flock to it. They like the dark themes. They like the camera. They like the soundtrack. They liked the performances, and people misbehaving. They like seeing that because they want to misbehave. That's how youth is. They're full of energy and the spark of life. In the meantime, Hollywood is making films like Darling, a musical with James Garner and Julie. Mary Poppins, Julie Andrews, and You're Wonderful, and she was in the musical also. Besides Mary Poppins, I'm drawing a blank. Sound of Music. Anyway, and those are actually very huge, and they did well at the box office, by the way. But they were not known as edgy or cutting edge. Nothing rock and roll about it. And so a movie like Darling comes along, and people just go, "What is going on? Who wants to see this?" It's not a bad movie, folks. I've seen it, of course. But does a 17-year-old want to see that movie at the drive-in? No, they don't. But they also want to see beach party movies. And this came out. There was a company called American International that started, and they started making movies for the youth market, just like Roger Corman. They're in competition. They saw the writing on the wall. They could make a boatload of money through the drive-in movie theaters by looking at the youth market. The youth were eating up rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, essentially. And so they made a series of movies called their beach party movies, and several, maybe a half a dozen, maybe more. A lot of them starred Annette Funicello, who was a former Musketeer. Yes, that's right. And that means a Disney Musketeer. She was on TV in the 50s, clean cut and wholesome. All of a sudden, Annette grew up, and she was built like crazy. And she's wandering around in a bikini now, except for she kept her modesty, and the bikini never was pulled up pretty high, folks, and never revealed her belly button. Because that's, if you do that, you know what that means. If you don't know what it means, ask your friends or ask your parents, what does that mean? And Frankie Avalon, they're really wholesome movies. I went to these things as a kid. I love them. I didn't know what was going on, but I like watching women dancing on the beach in bikinis. Come on, what 14-year-old doesn't want to see that? And so the American International knew what the audience was, and they knew what they wanted. They wanted kind of frivolous entertainment, kids frolicking on the beach. At the time, the American music scene was getting started with some good rock and roll, but it was the British that had changed everything, not us. But at the time, the Beach Boys was a hugely popular band, Jan and Dean, and people wanted to go surf. California looked like paradise. What a better to surf every day, go to school, and frolic on the beach in your bikini with your friends at night, and playing rock and roll on a record player. The sex was wholesome. They weren't doing drugs, folks. They weren't even drinking in these things, not like they do now. But they're having a good time, and they just were wholesome entertainment. Really, they were, and they made a lot of money. So Hollywood doesn't know what to do. These films aren't coming out of Hollywood studios. They're coming out of independent studios. Hollywood is still trying to make these old-fashioned movies like Dr. Dolittle with Rex Harrison, where, it's the musical where he talks to the animals. I mean, they remade it into a movie, Eddie Murphy, a couple years ago. Cute movie, cute soundtrack, but the kids stayed away in droves. Making movies like Hello, Dolly with Barbra Streisand and can't think of the name of him right off. It's drawing a blank right now. Come on. Great 60s actor. I'll come up in a second. Walter Matthau. And it's a musical. Broadway, huge Broadway musical. Hello, Dolly. And they made it into this extravagant, bloated, big budgeted Hollywood movie. And it lost a boatload of money. A movie called Cleopatra, which came out in 1963, literally bankrupted 20th Century Studios. And they had to they started selling property to pay off their debt. If anybody knows LA at all, have you ever heard of Century City? It's West LA. It's mostly financial stuff, high-rise buildings right now. Well, that was all a movie studio at one time, and they started selling that's why it's called Century City. It's from 20th Century Fox, and they start selling off the property to pay off their debt. And so then it turned into office buildings and expensive condos, and that's what it is today. 20th Century kept moving further and further out. They were still active, especially on television, but they're further west. Just to give an example, the series MASH was a 20th Century production, very successful. 20th Century decided to focus a lot on television to make their bread and butter. Um, so all this was happening right when these new directors like Francis Coppola, George Lucas, your beloved Star Wars director Steve Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Terrence Malick, to name a few, Robert Altman, who created, who directed MASH and Nashville, and so many more other masterpieces. They were looking at Hollywood a different way, and they were considered auteur directors. Remember, I mentioned the word auteur last week. The French respect the auteur, the director, the author of their own work. They have their own personal stamp, not on just on the themes, on the story, on the way the camera moves, the lighting. They have their own look. And so you go to see these directors became famous enough that you couldn't wait to see their next movie because you know what you're going to get. And so when you went to see let's say, for example, a Mike Nichols movie, who he had directed, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, his second film, and that was a huge, huge hit. Elizabeth Taylor won the Academy Award. Sandy Dennis, who's in that, won the Academy Award. George Segal, who just died 2 days ago, was nominated. The great Richard Burton should have won, but he didn't. And it won for Best Cinematography, and the cinematography is raw. It's in-your-face, edgy, raw. These people don't look beautiful, they look human. And there's beauty in that. Mike Nichols comes in and with the first two movies of his career, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and The Graduate. 1967 with Dustin Hoffman and Anne Bancroft. It changed movie history. Game changers, folks. Along with the same year of The Graduate, we had Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, directed by Michael Penn. And not Michael Penn. Not coming with his name. Penn's last name. Anyway, changed the course of cinema history because those films came out of a Hollywood studio. All of a sudden, the studios didn't know what to do anymore. They didn't know what the youth wanted, but these young directors did because they were the age of the moviegoers. They'd gone to film school. This is the film school generation. They came out of USC, UCLA, Columbia, New York, NYU, and they learned how to make movies in school. And they're obsessed with watching movies from Hitchcock to John Ford to John Huston to Godard, Truffaut, Bergman, Kurosawa, Fellini, and they wanted to be part of it. They wanted to make their version of the 400 Blows, their version of Breathless, with a European sensibility. And that's important because Hollywood, the studio heads they don't get it. They didn't get that sensibility. It looked like art film to them. And that was not a good word to toss around to those guys because they want to make money. All of a sudden, Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, made a boatload of money. And the studio bosses had to look at that seriously and think, maybe these new young auteur directors coming up, maybe they do know something we don't. We should listen to them. And so they did. And now we're off and running into what some people refer to, myself included, but just don't take my word for it. There's been many books written about it and documentaries. The last golden age of Hollywood cinema. Yes, they're making more money now than they ever have, but I'm talking about content, not money. I'm not talking about box office returns. Nobody cared yet. I'm talking about content. Meaningful, small stories like The Graduate, Five Easy Pieces, The Last Detail, Shampoo, McCabe and Mrs. Miller. There's 100 great films that came out of this era. That's what the documentary you're going to watch, the quiz is going to be based on, is going to show you. Started in essentially, well, started with the big start was those movies I mentioned. But the documentary starts with essentially the game-changing movie was called Easy Rider, starring Peter Fonda, produced by him and directed by Dennis Hopper, and starred him, and he helped write the script along with Terry Southern. And Jack Nicholson is one of the stars in it. He stole the show, got nominated for an Oscar, and it was the first time in the history of films that a film coming out of the Hollywood studio system used rock and roll hits, not just a soundtrack of rock and roll, but actually hits of the day. And so the soundtrack has all these hits from Jimi Hendrix to the band to Born to Be Wild. Maybe you know that song. It's a great song to drive your car fast to or drive a motorcycle fast to. Steppenwolf. And those were all, that was unheard of. Nowadays, you couldn't afford that because the artists would want a lot of money. In those days, they got most of it free because it was a different time, folks. Just to get your music onto a movie was enough. Easy Rider changed literally everything. That's why the documentary is called Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. So the documentary starts in about 68, goes to about 80, and that's when the movie Raging Bull came out, directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Robert De Niro. So they're saying for those 10 years, those movies bookended this youth market auteur directors that came in and had freedom to express their auteur visions until they dropped the ball and they got caught up in excesses, drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and dropped the ball. And then a filmmaker who didn't have sex, who didn't enjoy drugs, who didn't understand rock and roll, by the name of Steve Spielberg, came along and directed a movie called Jaws, 1975. And it was the first movie in the history of all films that made $100 million. Unheard of. Now it's no big deal. It happens every weekend on fifth-rate entertainment movies come out of Hollywood. Now you have to make maybe $1 billion to get noticed, and that's why these franchises, that's what they're shooting for, $1 billion. And they're shooting for the big money. They don't care about you. They don't care how smart you are. They figured you're dumb, and you'll go to this movie. You'll go to X-Men how many times? You'll see Spider-Man over and over again if they make it entertaining enough for you to give them their dollars. And we do. But for a 10-year period, 69 to 79, 80, the auteur directors took over, and story took precedent over special effects and wholesale entertainment. And there was a hope. Now, my personal story, which I'll share with you probably on Monday a little bit, I was coming of age here. I was still in high school, and I saw those movies by all these wonderful guys, and I started understanding what a director does, and I wanted something. I actually dreamed about going to Hollywood, and I did in the late 70s because of these movies that came out. We'll talk about more of my personal stuff later, not right now. I'm going to close this down. I'm going to hopefully post this on my usual stuff on Canvas. Watch that Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. I'm not going to sign it yet as an assignment, but it will be the quiz next week. We won't have a paper due next week. You have that done already. You have a paper due on Monday. So we'll do the quiz, and I'll probably sign the quiz on Wednesday, so you won't be stressed out about writing your paper and during the quiz. And the quiz will be a essay quiz. It's not true or false. It's not multiple choice. You're going to have to do some thinking. So please, when you're watching the movie, make sure you pay attention and take notes. That's about it, folks. Hope you're staying safe. You're staying lighter later. Hope you guys are doing something creative in your lives. Hope your dreams are starting to happen and fulfilled. As the pandemic is loosening its reins on us, maybe life will get better in 2021 than it has been. Until that, just remember, everything is cinema. Don't think it isn't. See you after the weekend. The story of film continues.